So a little story about myself before we jump in. I'm Jewish. I was brought up in the 1960s, and I learned from my parents about the Holocaust, which was still at that moment a very raw and emotional event. And so I heard about Hitler, I heard about Auschwitz, I heard about the Nazis, the concentration camps, and I also heard about Israel. And Israel was really what was framed as the solution to all this terror that people had experienced, right? It was a Jewish homeland. It was a place where Jews could go to be safe. And that was how I was brought up, and how a lot of people, a lot of Jews of my generation were brought up. And I never really thought much at all about, what was the land of Israel before it became Israel. I think the implied understanding was it's a land without people for a people without a land. I never heard the word Palestine growing up. I also never heard the word Palestinian. And so I had no idea what had really gone on in the process of creating the state of Israel. And I would say until maybe 10 years ago, I hadn't really looked into it seriously. And when I did, what I found out is that there was really a massive ethnic cleansing campaign. There were over 1 million Palestinians living on the land that the United Nations allocated to Israel. And 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed through violence and massacres, forced out of that land. And we'll talk about that. That's the history I want to share with you. It's the understanding I came to, and I think that that's, at least for Jews of my generation, a very difficult bridge to cross, because you have to unlearn everything that you were taught as a kid. Right? And I think it's really important for other Jews of my generation to reckon with what happened, because it reframes the whole way you understand the current situation, how we got to the current situation. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead now. First thing, can everyone see the text? Is it clear enough for you? Okay, good. So we are meeting on the ancestral land of the Ho-Chunk tribe. And we always start with this to recognize where we are and where the land that we're on, what its history is. And there are a lot of direct connections to the experience of the Palestinians between them and the Native Americans here in North America, which you can see from the map, how the area of those people became fragmented during the whole process. All right, so I want to give you kind of a geographic orientation first. Palestine and Israel are really in the southwest corner of Asia. And if we zoom in, what you see is that Israel, Palestine is here. This is the Mediterranean Sea. We've got the Egyptian Sinai Desert to the south. This is Egypt. You've got Jordan to the east, which the Jordan River is an important boundary that we'll be talking about. Lebanon directly to the north. And if you go further to the east is the country of Iran, which we also will be talking about because of what's happening in the current events. And Mohammed is going to be talking a lot about this whole area from his experience. And zeroing in a little more, so this is the outline currently of the state of Israel and the occupied West Bank, Gaza, and also occupied East Jerusalem.
And occupied Golan Heights from Syria.
From Syria.
Up and down.
That's right. Now we'll drill in a little further. This is the Gaza Strip, okay? Thank you, Jeremy. And the Gaza Strip is really small. It's 25 miles long, which is roughly the distance from Lafarge to Gaze Mills. All right? And we will talk a little more about what's been happening in Gaza. All right, so that's the geographic orientation. I want to take you through the timeline because not everyone has a picture of all these historical events. So in the 1890s, That is the founding of the Zionist movement in Europe. And by the way, I never heard the word Zionism growing up. I didn't know that the State of Israel was the culmination of a movement that started in the 1890s. I thought it was a response to the Holocaust. All right, so let's define Zionism. It's an ethno-cultural nationalist movement. It emerged in Europe in the late 19th century, and it aimed to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. And Zionism was, in part, a response to the persecution of Jews in Europe. And Zionism is a form of settler colonialism, so it couples the land with the need for a Jewish demographic majority on that land. So that raises the question, what do we mean by settler colonialism? So settler colonialism, it's a system of oppression that's based on genocide and colonialism, and it aims to displace the population of a nation, which is often indigenous people, and replace it with a new settler population. So why is the word genocide on here? If you think about what it takes to tear an indigenous people away from the land that they and their families have lived on for generations, for centuries, it requires a lot of violence. It requires genocidal violence to force them off that land. So I want to talk about, we use the word colonial, right? So I want to talk about Zionism's colonial roots, and we'll start with the land. How many people have heard of the Balfour Declaration? Okay, close to half of you. So the Balfour Declaration was a letter written by the Britain colonial power. They had actually, Palestine was part of their spoils of winning World War I. And so they don't go back with Palestine beyond 1917, but they decided that they would grant a certain part of Palestine as a state for Jews. And it didn't just come out of nowhere. It came after decades of lobbying by the early Zionist leaders. And you have to ask the question, who were they to grant this land, right? They were just colonial power. It wasn't their land. Now, Zionism also has military and political roots in colonialism. So in the 1930s, there was a Palestinian rebellion against the British because the British were supporting the process of what Zionists were doing was they were buying land, often through absentee landlords, and then kicking the people who had been living and working on that land off and then bringing in settlers. So there was a rebellion against Britain for supporting that. Britain had to dedicate a large number of troops and weapons in order to suppress that rebellion. And in the process, they basically destroyed the Palestinian paramilitary units, and their leadership were either killed or exiled. And in that same war, Britain basically attached the Zionist militias to them in order to train them. They trained them in modern weaponry, and they trained them in the tactics for occupying and attacking Palestinian villages. All right, so the combination of these two things meant that when 1940s came around, the Palestinians were no match for these Zionist militias. So we're going to talk about some of the leaders of the Zionist movement, both in the early days and today as well. And there's a continuity there that I want to make sure comes through in what we talk about. And all of the discussion about these leaders is going to be in their own words, either statements they made publicly, diary entries, or in the archives. So this is not really like just an interpretation of what Ben Gurion said. This is what Ben Gurion said. Okay? So he was the leader of the Zionist movement, early 21st century. He said, let's not ignore the truth among ourselves. Politically, we are the aggressors and they defend themselves. The country is theirs because they inhabit it, whereas we want to come here and settle down. A very honest assessment of the situation, right? And we're going to see what the consequences of that perspective are. Joseph Weitz, who was the future head of the Jewish National Fund, which was responsible for the colonization of Palestine, he said, transfer does not serve only one aim, to reduce the Arab population. It also serves a second purpose, by no means less important, which is to evict land now cultivated by Arabs and to free it for Jewish settlement. There, the only solution is to transfer the Arabs from here to neighboring countries. Not a single tribe must be let off. So again, land is this crucial foundational understanding. And if you look at the language, and we'll come back to language again later, Weitz uses the word transfer twice in his statement. Transfer is a nice way of saying ethnic cleansing, okay? All right, so now we're going to come to the Holocaust. We are in the late 1930s, early 1940s. These are the photographs I grew up with, okay? The mass displacement of the Jews, the concentration camp, the starving children and people that have been forced into these camps, and the gas chambers. And it is really appalling for me to look at pictures coming out of Gaza, which are so reminiscent. The starving children, the mass displacement of the population multiple times. So again, just that's a quote unquote Jewish nation doing that is really hard to comprehend. All right, so now we're going to come to the creation of the State of Israel. In 1947, the land that the United Nations allocated to Israel, which is in white, had a population of 1.3 million Palestinians compared to 600,000 Jews. And the Jewish population owned just 7% of that land. So what did the UN do? They allocated 56% of the land with a slight Jewish majority, and the Palestinians got 42% of the land, 95% Palestinians on that land. And if you look at that strange map, you'll realize it looks a lot like a gerrymandered congressional district, right? And you can also understand why the Palestinians opposed this allocation because of how unjust and unequal it was, and also the Arab countries around it. All right, so now we're going to talk directly about the ethnic cleansing. Again, direct quotes from the Zionist leaders, Ben-Gurion. There are 40% non-Jews in the areas allocated to the Jewish state. This composition is not a solid basis for a Jewish state, even though they had received this unequal apportionment. And we have to face this new reality with all its severity and its distinctness. Such a demographic balance questions our ability to maintain Jewish sovereignty. Only a state with at least 80% Jews is a viable and a stable state. So here's where we couple the Jewish demographic majority with the land, which we talked about earlier. And some people will say what's happening in Palestine, Israel is complicated, but you can boil it down to land and demographics. Anyone know what percentage of Jews live in Israel today? 80%. Exactly what Ben-Gurion said was needed. This is 1948. It's on the eve of the massacre at Balad el-Sheikh. There's a need now for a strong and brutal reaction. If we accuse a family, we need to harm them without mercy, women and children included. Otherwise, this is not an effective reaction. During the operation, there is no need to distinguish between innocent and guilty. And again, a foreshadowing of the ideology that we see playing out today. Again, on the eve of a massacre, this is what's being articulated by the leadership. And they put together a plan called Plan D or Plan Dalet. The operations can be carried out in the following manner, either by destroying villages, by setting fire to them, by blowing them up, by planting mines in their rubble, and especially those population centers, which are the cities, that are difficult to control permanently. They had a month and a half, 2 months, before the actual date when the British were withdrawing from Palestine. And so they were pushing very hard at this point to get as much territory as they could. And so what was the ethnic cleansing like? Very violent. There were a number of massacres. This picture here is from the city of Haifa, which was a Palestinian city in 1947. There were, a number, somewhere between, 8 and 10 cities that were Palestinian cities. They were primarily an agricultural and pastoral people, but they had an urban culture, they had an urban life. The bombing of Haifa was so severe that these people fled into the sea. That's the Mediterranean Sea that they're rushing toward to escape that bombing. And then in the countryside, there was a massacre at Deir Yassin, where 200 or more villagers were basically lined up and slaughtered, men, women, and children. And word of that massacre spread throughout the countryside. And in response, out of fear, people fled. They fled their homes. They thought they were fleeing for a matter of weeks. Mohammed will talk more about this, but they took their key with them because they thought they would be going back. 750,000 people. All right, creation of the State of Israel. In 1948, I think it was April 15th, did I have that right? I'm not sure, might have been May. Anyway, creation of the State of Israel, huge celebrations, right? They had a vote in the United Nations, they had won the vote. Israel was born, we had a Jewish homeland, we had people thought the safety of a Jewish homeland. And at the same time, kind of the other side of the coin is the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. Both events really part of the same event. So now we have the State of Israel, we have 20% of the population are Palestinians, right? So that 20% came under direct military control by the new Israeli government. This is going to be part of Mohammed's story also. And lastly, 1967, Israel wins the Six-Day War, and that's when the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza begin. That was the start of expansion of settlements within the occupied territories and a network of roads to connect them. Becky and I went to Palestine in the fall of 2019, and as you go around the West Bank, there are settlements, large settlements on the hills everywhere. You can't go down the highway without seeing them. And here I am going to turn it over to Mohammed. I'm going to run. You tell me when you want me to move forward through the slides.
Yeah. Well, we're going to start with 48. England decides to withdraw from being the mandate, having the mandate on Palestine. So they withdrew with keeping their all their arms and bases, etc., open to the Israeli militias and army. And the attack started. I was born in January of 48. In our area, the upper Galilee, like the top area here, this here, I was born in a village north of Nazareth, 10 miles north of Nazareth. That whole area, while the state of Israel was declared May 15, no Israeli forces have been in that area at that point. There were some skirmishes around, but not quite like the attack, not until July. July of 48, they occupied the rest of the areas here, the villages. There were a couple of massacres of people accused of carrying arms against the Israeli militias. But most of the villages north of us, this is the Galilee was kept, that's why to this day it's still Arab villages in that area. Nazareth and a circle about 10 miles around it, with the exclusion of Acre and Haifa, the cities that Bob mentioned. These were evacuated. That area apparently did not, from what I understand, historically, did not have enough forces to control and force people out. So they stayed, including our village. Some of like my grandfather and my father and his brother left for Lebanon about 2-3 months before, and they got stuck in that they couldn't come back. In July of 48, my mother, at the behest of my grandmother, was asked to join her family because nobody knows what will happen. And that's how we ended in Lebanon, my family, as refugees later on. Now, the rest of the area that was left was considered to be under military rule. So what does that mean, under military rule? It means that nobody can leave their village without a permit from the military governor at the time. And everything kind of like froze in time for some time, and then gradually again, but that continued, that military rule continued till 1968. Officially lifted after 67 war, but actually implemented in 68. So then people can move about and all that. Our journey to Lebanon was similar to others, that at least there was panic, and lots of the villages today, for example, when you see the skirmishes between Lebanon and Israel on those villages, these were all Arab villages that were evacuated and replaced by settlements, or later on developed into towns and villages exclusively for the Jewish population. Later on, you could see the Israelis they tell a story of 1949, Ben Gurion for the first time driving through that north part of Palestine. And he looked around, went through the villages, and he looked around and he said, one village, Arab village after the other. And he said, that shouldn't happen. So then the decision was made. If you look in any of the villages in that area, the large area, the Upper Galilee, each village, any hilltop was kind of barbed wired around it and taken on as a military kind of base. Nobody can touch it. And later on developed into some sort of settlement, and later on developed into some sort of exclusive housing again. So like around our town, Arabi, currently, I visited in 2022, and things that I didn't see before, I'll come to that. Like, for example, all of these hills around Arabi, if you're sitting in a town like Lafarge here and looking at the hills over there, that hills was occupied by a settlement, and now it's a housing gated community only for the Jews. So the people in Arab Israelis, they call them, will not be allowed to buy any housing there or live there. So that's one way they use to control the area, both economically and otherwise. I'll go back to 1948. So in 1948, we were in Lebanon. My mother joined my father, and we lived as refugees, like I said. United Nations Relief and Works Agency was created at the time to deal with the refugees. Not only in Lebanon, do you
want me to forward?
Yeah. We'll come to that one.
Is this the one you want, Mohammed?
Yes. Now, see, these dots are the refugee camps in the surrounding countries. So you get Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, West Bank, and Gaza here. These are places where there were refugee camps from Palestinians that moved from Palestine north, east, south, etc. And United Nations, UNRWA, you've heard it in the news, it was tasked with the responsibility of taking care of social, medical, education, and sometimes even nutrition help. Growing up in Lebanon as a refugee, I attended 6 years of elementary school in an UNRWA school. And let me tell you that provided, of course, work for the teachers that fled from Palestine, but I also had great teachers. We had good education in those 6 years. My brothers actually had 2 more years, so there was now till 8th grade in UNRWA schools. And then you have to go to a private school. One thing the Palestinians have collectively and unconsciously thought of is the importance of education. They had nothing else to rely on. And so importance of education that prompted that most of the time the kids, Palestinian kids, even the ones going in technical school system, have excelled enough to secure jobs in the surrounding countries and areas. And they eked out a living of just about anything in any field. And we progressed and seeded. For example, my own family, all my brothers have professional degrees. But the same thing in any of these refugee camps in these areas. They have excelled in education. They have tried to survive. And even, I'm going to go back to this area here, the Upper Galilee, the Arab villages in there. I want to also stress that they also realized the importance of education because they were under stress and military rule for some time. And our little village of Arabi, that was in 1948 about 2,500, is about 26,000 people now, have in fact the honor of having the highest doctors per capita in the whole of Israel. And it's very important. They are survivors. Gaza, refugee camps, 2.2 million in very stressed situation before this, for years and years, since 1948. Also have one of the highest per capita college degrees in that area, in the Arab world, including Israel. So you have to understand and kind of keep in mind that this is a a sample of a stressful situation made sort of like viable and better for people. They bettered their lives, but at the same time, each one, I can speak for each one, still thinks or is attached to Palestine. So it's, can you move forward to the other one?
Okay.
There. And is that the first one?
Yeah, just
Oh, okay. This is my parents here. I'm trying to weave my personal story. While it might be just personal, but it also gives you an idea of what Palestinians all over the world there. You can imagine that actually there's a Palestinian all over the world. You could think of somewhere in the far distant areas, there's a Palestinian, but a Palestinian that did not forget where they came from. This is on our farm. This is my mother. This is my father. This is my father helping my father-in-law with milking. Can you move?
Mm-hmm. Is that in Wonewoc?
Yeah. Yeah. This is my mother in her younger years. You could tell I speak of my mother because I was 6 months old, roughly, when she literally carried me 30 miles to get to the Lebanon, to where she met the rest of her family. And she always talked about the bond between us that's separate because, as you know, when you have 6 kids, you always have a preferred son. So I am the preferred son, but it is for this unfortunate reason that she carried me over the border and we developed that bond. This is my father with my firstborn, my son, and you can. This is my father. This is me here, probably 9 or 10 years old. My father, he was a son of a landowner / businessman. So they were well-to-do. And my father, Bob mentioned the 1936 rebellion in Palestine against the British and the British rule. My father was because it was a little village, didn't have enough. He was in 7th grade in a private school in Nazareth. And he got it in his head that he should participate in that somehow. So what he did was he had and always did have a good handwriting, calligraphy, Arabic calligraphy. And so he wrote like hundreds of those papers that asked people to strike or close business or civil disobedience, in other words. And he was caught by the British, put in jail for a few days, assessed a fine, and then that was the end of his education because they kicked him out of the school and no other school will take him after that. So when we this is in Lebanon. So when so what to do? What business? My grandfather had a few coins with him, and we sustained us for a little while. But then he had to have a job, so he learned how to weld and became a welder. This is, in the words of my grandfather, a kid that did not. He felt he was privileged, so he didn't gather or participate in gathering the olives from the olive trees because it's not his thing. But he became a welder, and later on worked in all these tanks, storage tanks in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the pipelines. That's one of he worked on those projects. This is our family later on. That's my father me there in that corner, and 4 boys altogether at this point. You could move on. And this is my father, this is my grandfather, and this is our family expanded by 1. And this is the 5 boys. We have 1 girl in the family. That's before she was born there, that picture. But so speaking of my grandfather did not participate. It's like for him, time froze in 1948. He was a good businessman, he knew what to do, but he refused to participate in that because he was obsessed with the fact that he started out with weeks, months, and it's gonna happen. I grew up, I remember he made me read and write in 1st grade, actually, and I remember him trying to make me read the letters that he wrote to the United Nations Refugee Agency at the time, that to have to reunite families. So he would have writing petitions for them to reunite. And I remember that year after year, these petitions will go out and no answer, of course. And I don't think he even gave up that idea that he's going back. And it is true of his generation. What's left? That's my youngest brother there. This is Sidon. It's a fishing, just to give you, it's a fishing port. Sidon is an old city. It's about 5,000 years old, and it's one of the oldest cities in the world that's still being occupied or having people live in it. It is a port city. You can't see it here, but see these boats? These are the boats that when you had the picture of Haifa, people in the Mediterranean Sea kind of like trying to flee. These are the kind of boats like this. It's like a bass boat or something that they use to go from Haifa to Sidon, Lebanon north, to flee the market. And for years and years, we could see these boats are fishing boats, and they have either acre or Haifa on them as the number, acre and the number, and they were using them still for fishing. And that's just me walking about. And you know, like when I said we continued our life, we strived, we participated in things. Here's me, I was in the Boy Scout. This is my first degree in Boy Scout. This is beginning of high school right there. And freshman college, graduate school in chemistry at the American University in Beirut. And graduated master's in chemistry, 1970. This is, after graduation here, rewarded myself. I was a TA, so I saved some money. And rewarded myself by going to Egypt. First time for me, out of Lebanon altogether. And this is in Cairo. This is called Al Jazeera Tower. It's a tower, and it has a revolving restaurant way up on top. That has a story I want you to tell you. That tower. That tower in it started in 1956. Kermit Roosevelt, who was the deputy CIA director at the time. There was a new leader in Egypt after they got rid of the monarchy, Nasser. And Kermit came to him with a briefcase, and he said, "This is a gift from the American people, $3 million, and set it on his table. So Nasser said, "Okay, thank you." But the next day, he gathered his people, and he said, "I want to do something with these $3 million, but something to more or less poke an eye in those people that tried to insult us." So they announced that they're building this, and he wanted to be a pharaonic, like a pharaoh's kind of style thing. And then within a year or so, they built it with that money. And that was the end of the... Kermit Roosevelt wrote a report after that saying that we cannot deal with these people. Well, because they had the mindset of, at the time, banana republics. So they kind of, give money and do stuff. And I think that mindset, it's still here to this day, in a way. Not necessarily giving money, but at least that these are lesser people that we can manipulate. What else? Okay. 1971, I took a job. Well, I actually interviewed for a job, and they told me, one of the things they told me, it's a whole different thing because it's an education. I graduated master's chemistry. I knew I was going to continue in chemistry, but I had obligations. There are other brothers behind me that needed help, so I need to take a job. But during the interview, they said, "Do you mind? Part of your job is to travel to the West Bank and Gaza. Do you mind?" I said, "No." They offered me the job. I took it. And as I was leaving, the Swiss director of the Institute of Education, that's part of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization, said, "Don't you want to know how much we're going to pay you?" I said, "Yeah, tell me." I just heard that I can go to the West Bank and Gaza, and that was it for me. So I took that job. It was in teacher training, in-service teacher training for UNRWA schools. So Lebanon, remember that map we showed? Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, West Bank, and Gaza were under that jurisdiction. So wherever there are refugee camps, there are going to be schools and teachers and teacher training in science education. That was my job. So that was my first visit. When I got to Jerusalem, I called my uncle, who stayed behind, who was still there in that village. And they all came. There were about 6 or 7 people came to get me from Jerusalem and went to the town. And so here's some, I don't know how, they're not very clear to me from here, but are they clear to you? There's just to give you they're uncles I haven't seen. I was 6 months when I left. So this is roughly about, 23 years later. And uncles, what do you call it? Grandfather was living there on my mother's side. And so I went there. Now all my uncles have kids. And so these are pictures of me. And you could see this here? Mm-hmm. That's the passport there. The UN passport. Because otherwise, I wouldn't be able to go to Israeli part. I would be able to go to Jerusalem through the United Nations, but I needed a special permit to go to visit my old village. So you could move back. That's the same thing here. These are my uncles on both father's and mother's side. And this is another uncle with all his family. One of the things that was going for them within the Galilee or the Arab minority within Israel is, and it was also an accusation that they had too many kids. They make too many kids. And that's kind of like, that's why they exploded from about 225,048 to roughly about, well, 10 times, to, 100 times, to about 2 million and a quarter. About, right now, they're about 21% of the population within Israel, not counting West Bank and Gaza. Okay?
So if you had not been part of the United Nations, you would not have been able to go to Jerusalem.
Sorry? Huh?
If you had not been part of the United Nations job, you would not have been able to go to Jerusalem.
No. And this is me here, and this is where they cleared, it was in existence, the Wailing Wall, but they cleared a huge area here. That means demolished houses and stuff to do it. But this is the Wailing Wall. This is a picture of me and a colleague of mine. This is the Dome Rock Mosque. This is in the area of the Al-Aqsa Mosque that's now in the news. But there's a Dome Rock. There's a gold dome and there's a silver dome. This is the silver dome. In 1972 was burned by somebody like now in the news, like a Ben Gvir or some of those extremists, was burned down at the time, 72. And it took about, and that's another thing that, talking about the influence of the United States, that Dome Rock would not have been repaired if it wasn't for the influence of the Nixon administration at the time. They made him do it, actually. It was quite an influence, and they made him allow the repairs on that mosque. Okay. This is our kids, my mother, my father, and you could. Okay, now we go to some combination of artwork and also of significance. This is a photo of an olive tree. One thing they do, the settlers in the West Bank, for example, when they take a hilltop, first, there's each town, it's all hilly, rolling hills. It's not unlike this area here. So each hilltop, first they kind of like I said, they barbed wire an area they want to take, and then if they get rid of okay, so there's ownership. There's people that own that land. So if there's olive trees, they'll cut those olive trees because they want to cut the relationship to that land with people. So this is signifies how attached people are. And you could move. And artwork, this is very significant. So there's a Palestinian woman here. This is an Egyptian artist, 2010, friend of mine, had the key. The key is very significant in Palestinian life. The key, because there were lots of refugees that took the key with them when they became refugees, that they're going to come back. And the key is very, very, very significant. And this is the cactus, the edible cactus. And it's in Arabic culture, it's synonymous with patience. So patience is a key to an opening or happiness. And same thing, look at the again, Palestinian girl with the key. It's one more.
Yep. When we visited Palestine, there's the annexation wall, the separation wall you've heard about. There's a lot of artwork that's been done on the Palestinian side of that wall. The key is in much of that artwork. It is really a very important thing that people hold on to because it's part of the right of return to go back to that homeland, which they've never been permitted to do.
And this is nowadays, this is 2022 picture of Arabi. I don't know if I can point to it good here, but see, this is Arabi here. These are the hills here. There's a settlement and housing development here. The towns, when we say one town to the other, there's probably within 2 miles, there's another town. In fact, in 1971, when I was working with UNESCO, there was our town, and then another town with 2 miles stretch between them, and now they have joined, right now. And one thing, the Palestinians, to this day, they're supposed to be citizens and Israeli Arabs, they call them, and yet they have very, very tough time with obtaining permits to build. So with all these families growing, they tend to add on to their houses. They want to add to their houses, and it's very difficult to get a permit to do that. And when they do get a permit, they build on and on. So it's like a cluster of things. But then also, some people they build anyway, and they pay large amounts in fines, and sometimes risk the authorities will come and demolish their homes. And that has been also the case in the West Bank, the same thing. Now, I want to go back to that, the map, the Gaza.
Which one? The map?
The one that showed nowadays West Bank and Gaza. Okay.
This one?
Yeah. So when we talk about, although this is this area here, but when we talk about, maybe the other one, the one before it. Yeah, more. There. Okay. So you see here, this little Gaza, this is West Bank nowadays. Not nowadays, sorry, in 1967. Now, Gaza here is really had Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and Deir al-Balah, and very small towns. Gaza is an ancient city from the Roman times. And in 1948, refugees flooded from all these surrounding areas up to here into this area here. So Gaza, when I went in 1971 first time, the refugee camps were about 80% of the area. So 80% of the people also. 80% of the people have refugee status, meaning they came from somewhere else. They were not from Gaza. Only like I said, people that actually originally lived in those cities at the time were not refugees. So when we talk about Gaza now, essentially it's a big refugee camp. There's no question about it. The United States State Department, year after year, for years and years, acknowledged that fact, that they acknowledged the refugee camps, acknowledged the occupation when Gaza was occupied, and the occupation in the West Bank. And in fact, to this day, still the State Department acknowledges and it calls it occupied in the State Department reports. But what has the international community and the United States done to that? So when we talk about, can you move to the other one with the settlements? So this was occupied in 1967. There, no.
Or do you want to see
The one with that shows the
panels?
progression from in the West Bank. There, yeah. So this is the West Bank and Gaza, and this is 2005, and it's more now. Meaning, so they were, you could see the green areas with the Arab villages, Arab towns, they're disconnected. You know, I don't know you. I want you to look at it with your mind and your heart and think about it. If you're living in an area in Hillsborough or in Lafarge and you're disconnected, roughly disconnected from going to Viroqua, for example, meaning in order to go to Viroqua, you have to go through roadblocks. And in order to go to Viroqua, you have to go on roads that only designated for the Arabs, for the others. You cannot go on roads that go to these settlements that were established. It's beyond even, I mean, I don't know what international law or violation of an international law now is, but again, technically, the United States have acknowledged the fact that these are illegal. But do they do anything about it? Have they even sanctioned anybody about the occupation and the settlements that are illegal completely and under international law? And so then you see in 2022, when the last visit we went to the West Bank, you're going to go over to Bethlehem, and you probably was there when you visited, the wall that was right outside the church, sort of. I mean, you can't, and we had friends there that one of them teaches at the university, and he said that one of the things that it takes about 10, 15 minutes to go to Jerusalem, his son has to go to college, and it takes him now 2 hours because they have to go around these walls and around the blocks and stand at any time, lines and lines of people to go through. I can't say enough about this, but it's really something that is not, stressed enough, or when I listen to the State Department briefings, etc., they act like nothing is happening, and I'm not sure where to go with this thing here, because it's very, very unstable, both for the United States and for the State of Israel. They have somehow to deal with this population. If you look at it, while they are disconnected here, there's about 3.5 million of Palestinians in the West Bank. There's about 2.2 million in Gaza. There's another 2.25 million within Israel. What's their objective? And it's not like if you judge them by what they say, their leaders, whether you call them fanatic or regular politics playing in Israel, they don't mind saying, for example, one of the objectives was in the Gaza war was to drive all the Palestinians out and get it over with, and then they can disperse. Ben Gurion, in the past, at 1948, he thought if we drive all these Palestinians, they'd just dissolve into those other places, into those other countries, and disappear, and that will be it. But it's not acceptable, like I said, and yeah. What's next, Bob?
I go.
I skimmed over my little story, and like I said it's not. There. This is important here because when I lived in Lebanon until 1976, I lived for a year outside Lebanon. 1977, there was a civil war in Lebanon, and the office that I worked with in UNESCO moved to Jordan. So I stayed about a year or so in Jordan. And from 48 till to this day, Israel did not find it. I mean, when people hear now Israel forces and Hezbollah move, act like as if Hezbollah came out of nowhere. They are the people there living in South Lebanon. But Israel did not find it at all. At all. They were not inhibited by any force to go in 1968 and destroy the airport in Beirut. They 75 to 82, there was this here. In 82, Israel invades Lebanon. Well, it lived, my mother and my parents lived that 1948 again, because when they were living in Sidon and the Israelis came and occupied Sidon, they asked the whole population to get up on the hills, and they camped for like 3-4 days in their car outside until they went through and swept the whole city. So and then time after time, they occupied South Lebanon up until the year 2000. And all these things happened under Israel's either attack or direct involvement. Yeah. I think I'll stop at this point.
Yep, I'll pick up here.
Yeah.
I think you can tell how passionate Mohammed is about this, and I think that's true of many Palestinians that have been through this entire process. So what about October 7th, right? So question for you all. When did armed fighters from the Gaza Strip first attack inside Israel? Any guesses? Hmm? Yeah, 1953. So that's 30 years before the founding of Hamas. 5 years after the ethnic cleansing campaign in 47 to 49. So why did they attack inside Israel? This is back in 53. They'd been torn from the land on which they and their families had lived for generations. Mohammed described how people were forced out of the land that is now Israel into that Gaza Strip. That's the experience of these people there. They could look over the fence and see the land where they had lived for generations. So it was their land that became Israel. So, was everything okay on October 6th? I would say most Israelis and American Jews thought so. But 75 years had passed since the Nakba, which is how Palestinians refer to the ethnic cleansing of 750,000 out of what became Israel. And the Palestinians had never been allowed to return to their homeland. In 2007, Israel placed Gaza under a total siege. Nothing could go in, nothing could go out without Israeli approval. And this decimated the Gazan economy, and it made it dependent on humanitarian aid. So people were trapped, people could not leave. Medicine, food, water, all of that had to be permitted. And the Gazans tried nonviolent resistance. So the Great March of Return, which I think was 2019, hundreds of thousands gathered on the Palestinian side of the border. Over 200 were killed by Israeli snipers, and more than 25,000 were shot, many in the leg, called kneecapping. Many needed amputations, And kneecapping became a sport for some of the Israeli snipers. And at the same time, we have the destruction of Palestinian homes in the West Bank, the displacement by settlers and attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. These were intensifying during this period leading up to October 7th. So, what about October 7th? International law supports armed resistance against colonial domination and occupation. Now, the military targeting of civilians is a violation of international law. So that's where the line is. Armed resistance is lawful, targeting of civilians is not. So there were 850 Israeli civilians killed on October 7th, targeted or otherwise. And that's been used to justify the genocidal violence that's now underway in Gaza. So what does history teach us about violence under a colonial regime? So for one thing, the violence of the colonizer is always disproportionate compared to the colonized. And you can see this. So this 1139 that were killed on October 7th includes military, soldiers. And now we are actually up over 40,000 Palestinians that have been killed in Gaza. And that 40,000 is a vast undercount when you consider the impact of the war. There was an article just published in the Lancet Medical Journal, internationally recognized, and they have estimated that, looking at other recent wars, that the actual death toll due to the war is 3 to 15 times higher than the confirmed number. And their estimate is that as a result of the war that Israel's waged on Gaza, we actually have 186,000 Palestinians have been killed. And if that's true, that is 8% of the entire population of Gaza. And double that number are people that have been injured. So 1 out of every 4 people in Gaza has either been killed or injured. So these indirect deaths that are not in the 40,000, deaths from starvation, dehydration, infectious disease, non-communicable disease like diarrhea, which is due to raw sewage. Israel has destroyed all the sewage processing plants in Gaza. Reproductive deaths, and there are an estimated 10,000 people trapped under the rubble, decomposing. And as of yesterday, the first confirmed case of polio. Anyone know who Frantz Fanon is? He's a major author who thought about what it meant, what violence under colonial systems meant. And he said basically that the colonized internalizes the violence of the colonizer, and in the process of decolonization, the colonizer vomits up this oppression in the form of more violence. Another way to put it would be the longer and more oppressive the colonial rule, the more violent will be the anti-colonial movement. And again, the violence on October 7th only occurred after they attempted nonviolent resistance. There are examples in history, Nat Turner's rebellion against slavery, Native American resistance to centuries of genocide, all involved killing of civilians. And so what happened on October 7th, I think you could think about as an inevitable response to the 75 years following the ethnic cleansing. I want to just touch very briefly, I know we're running a little late on time. So on October 13th, Israel published the Intelligence Ministry strategy paper on what their options were with Gaza. This is now published 6 days after October 7th. And they settled on a certain strategy which said that they were going to evacuate Gazan population from the combat areas, and they were going to push them into the Sinai desert. That was their preferred strategy. And they were going to do it by a combination of evacuations, bombing, and military campaigns, starting from the north, moving to the south, which is exactly what happened. We had a heavy bombing campaign in the north, specifically Gaza City. They issued evacuation orders because they were going to conduct a military ground operation, forced the population to the center of Gaza, and then proceeded to bomb the center of Gaza to force evacuation further south, and then a ground invasion. And what that did is it pushed everyone, 1.3 million people, into Rafah. And Rafah, not coincidentally, is across the border from the Sinai Desert. Now, that plan did not work because Egypt refused to allow this massive number of refugees to come across. And so the process then became, they had not completed the extermination of Hamas. Now they wound up continuing to have to evacuate the population, bomb, and do further ground invasions. And we're stuck at this point in that dynamic. I want to give you a few quotes now from the current Zionist leaders. We're talking here about Netanyahu, first of all. He said, we're going to push plans to implement what he called voluntary migration of Palestinians to other countries. Again, language, voluntary migration, remember transfer. These are all ways of getting around what we're talking about as ethnic cleansing. So Netanyahu tasked Ron Dermer, who's the Minister of Strategic Affairs, to design a plan to thin, in quotes, the Palestinian population of Gaza. And what we are seeing today is a thinning. So far, roughly 8% have been killed. Finance Minister Smotrich, he called for Palestinians to leave Gaza, making way for Israeli settlers who could make the desert bloom. They want to resettle that land. And Ben-Gvir, who is the National Security Minister, said that the war provided an opportunity to concentrate on encouraging the migration of residents of Gaza, and that such a policy is a correct, just, moral, and humane solution. Again, language. They're going to encourage the migration. And perhaps the most direct and honest assessment is from the Agricultural Minister, Ali Dichter, referencing back to the ethnic cleansing in 47 and 48. He said, Gaza, Nakba 2023, that's how it'll end. And I have to say it feels familiar to the final solution in the Holocaust. And all of this killing of large numbers of Palestinians, women and children, not just men, but the men are also valued people. You have to dehumanize people if you're going to do that level of violence. And so this is just an example. This is from former Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked. She said, they, referring to the mothers of martyrs, should follow their sons. Nothing would be more just. They should go, as should the physical homes in which they raised the snakes. Otherwise, more little snakes will be raised there. And so you get this bestiality, these characterizations of these people. And you can think about slavery, too, in this country. And that becomes a kind of a justification for doing what you want to do. So a quick, where are we today? In May, the International Criminal Court prosecutors sought arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant for war crimes. And those war crimes included deliberate starvation. So Netanyahu and Gallant are essentially war criminals, according to the ICC. And back in January, the International Court of Justice ruled by a 15-2 vote that Israel was plausibly conducting a genocide in the Gaza Strip. So when people talk about genocide, it is not just an opinion. This is something that the highest court on the planet has concluded. Now, Netanyahu, awaiting a warrant for war crimes, was invited by both Republican and Democratic leadership to speak before Congress just on July 24th, and he received multiple standing ovations. There were some 100 Democrats who boycotted the speech, but the standing ovations included Republicans as well as many Democrats. And he made many obvious false claims. He said that Iran was funding the protests against Israeli genocide in the US. He's talking here about nonviolent protests constitutionally protected in the US. He said that Israel had not impeded the delivery of humanitarian aid. Well, obviously the ICC does not agree with that, and many humanitarian organizations, Doctors Without Borders being one of many, have said that Israel is blocking the delivery of aid. And his final thing was that civilian casualties in Rafah were practically none. There were 1.3 million people in Rafah. They bombed Rafah, and then they sent in tanks. And Rafah has basically been turned into like most of the rest of Gaza. It's in ruins. But there were practically no civilian casualties. Oh, there we go. Sorry, so next. On July 31st, Israel assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, who was the head of the political wing of Hamas, and he was the one who was representing Hamas in the ceasefire negotiations. How many people were aware of this assassination? Okay, most of you know. And so by assassinating him, by killing him, they essentially killed that round of ceasefire talks. And very significantly, they killed him on Iranian soil. They killed him in Iran, which is essentially an act of war. And that's where we stand now on the precipice of a regional war triggered by this assassination. And the massacres continue. There was a bombing on August 10th of a school that had been turned into a shelter in Gaza City, as most schools have been. And over 100, mostly women and children, were killed. It's been verified that Israel used small diameter bombs made by the US in that bombing attack. And that weaponry meant that of the more than 100 killed, there was not a single whole body that could be returned to the families. That's the level of explosive power that delivered. And Israel claimed without evidence that Hamas used the school as a command center. So the US role in all of this, we keep sending arms. After the school massacre, the Biden administration announced $3.5 billion in military aid would be released. That was part of a $17 billion aid package passed in April, on top of a $14 billion military aid package in November. The US provides 69% of Israelis' arms, and without those arms, they could not continue with their military operations. Biden has cautioned Israel many times to be more careful not to harm civilians, but he has authorized sending 14,000 2,000-pound bombs, which create those craters that you may have seen, enormous craters. And even the US said that they cause indiscriminate harm to civilians. And in spite of that, Biden just authorized another 1,800 2,000-pound bombs. So we're 10 months now into this military operation, this plausible genocide. We've got a minimum of 40,000 people killed, probably more, like 186,000. And Biden has never used cutting off the arms as leverage to force Israel to agree to a ceasefire deal. And it's been said, Biden could end the war with a phone call if he wanted to. And it has recently come to light that there's been extensive torture and sexual abuse in the Israeli prisons, where Palestinians who've been taken there from Gaza Many released ones have talked about sexual assault, physical beatings, sleep deprivation, and starvation. And video just emerged, which I am not going to show you the video, but it showed gang rape by the Israeli soldiers of a tied Palestinian prisoner. And it did lead to the arrest of 10 soldiers, but at least 5 have been now released. And these are the statements by the Israeli leaders, just to give you a sense as to how extreme the leadership in the society has become. A member of the Knesset, which is basically like the US Congress, if he is a Nukba, which is a Hamas militant, everything is legitimate, everything. But not all these people, not all these Palestinians in prisons are Hamas militants. Any action is permissible, even gang rape, for the security of the state, according to Ben-Gvir. And a crowd of right-wing protesters, including Minister Smotrich, attempted to break into the facility where the soldiers were being held to free them. And people have dubbed that the right to rape protest. I'm going to end there. That's not a very hopeful note, but the situation on the ground is very severe at this stage. And that's where we stand. So I want to open it up for questions. I know we ran a little long, but I hope that you will ask questions of us. And